is the Electile Dysfunction Podcast with Ashton Cohen.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Electile Dysfunction Podcast with Ashton Cohen. I'm Ashton Cohen. I am joined today by Dominic Frisby. Dominic is a financial writer and comedian, and one of the most interesting commentators, I think, in a whole range of financial topics and issues, from cryptocurrency to monetary and economic policy and history. He is the author of an excellent book, which I really enjoyed, Daylight Robbery: How Tax Shaped Our Past and Will Shape Our Future. Dominic, thanks so much for being with me.
Thank you very much for having me, Ashton. A pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. I wanted to start off with sort of the thesis of your book, and I want to ask you some questions based on that. So your book makes a point about how taxation shapes civilization, how it's essentially sort of like a foundational piece that sort of shapes society, and the rest of culture and politics follows from that. How does taxation shape civilization?
Well, when you talk about taxation, everyone immediately thinks, oh God, this is going to be boring, because it's such a boring subject and it's something that accountants talk about while they look at spreadsheets. But in fact, the central thesis of my book is that tax has shaped the entire course of civilization. Every great event in history, if you look at it, if you study it, you will find some kind of tax story, usually an untold one, behind it, without which that event would have unfolded in a very different way. Every war was paid for by some kind of tax. Every conquest was about taking over the tax base, the land, the labor, the produce, the profit. Every revolution was a rising up against some kind of injustice perpetrated by the tax system. Most political arguments today are ultimately an argument about taxation. Who pays for this? You know, they're arguing about what, Republican Democrat is basically an argument about a few percent of GDP, whether it's publicly paid or privately paid. And once you start to look at the world through this prism of taxation, you realize so much becomes clear: why things happened, why things are as they are, and what is going to happen. And the idea of some kind of duty to the greater collective, even the word duty is, we talk about duties, but this idea of the duty to the greater collective probably existed in the hunter-gatherer societies that predated civilization. But even if you look at ancient Mesopotamia, the very first written records we have, very first examples of writing, are tax documents. And taxation is as old as civilization itself. And in fact, there has never been a civilization without taxation of some kind. And there have been civilizations with very low levels of taxation. There have been civilizations where taxation was voluntary, such as in ancient Athens. They had liturgy, which was a voluntary taxation, but there still existed taxes. So tax, I'm afraid, as your founding father Benjamin Franklin said, is inevitable, as inevitable as death. But there are better ways to tax people and there are worse ways to tax people. I actually see tax as a measure of freedom. You can measure freedom by the extent to which you are taxed. So at one extent, you might have, an anarchy. Let's say anarchy actually existed in outside the theoretical world. Well, in an anarchy, an ordinary person would own 100% of his own labor. In the social democracies of today, we own 40-50% of our own labor, something like that. By the time you die, roughly 50% of everything you ever earn will have been taken from you by the state. And in a totalitarian state, the numbers are much higher, 75-80%. In North Korea, I don't think a worker owns any of his own labor. It's all taken from him, and in exchange, he's given a bit of food and shelter, I guess. In a slave society, the slave, he doesn't even own his own body, let alone his own labor. So those are the most extreme examples of, 80, 90, 100% tax, and then 0% tax at the other end. And we're, in the social democracies of today, somewhere in the middle. And I would like to see us more towards 15, 20% tax rather than 40, 50. Taxation as a percentage of GDP is over 50% if you include inflation, which most people don't, but they should.
You mentioned before that in talking about the feudal system, that the serfs owned essentially 50% of their labor. So the 50% of the time they had to work on the feudal lord's land, and then 50% of the time they could sort of till their own soil. And in social democracies in Europe and to a certain extent the United States, probably in California, you're looking at maybe 40-ish% when you factor everything in.
Yeah, it's thought that the serfs in Europe were basically the descendants of the slaves from the Roman Empire. And even though the Roman Empire crumbled, the serfs remained and they never got their freedom. And if you owned land, the serfs came with the land. A serf couldn't like go, actually, I'm going to leave and go somewhere else. You couldn't do that. If they did, they became outlaws. And the idea of a serf is he would be given a plot of land to work, to till. And 3 days of that week, he would have to till his lord's land. And the other 3 days, he could till his own. And so effectively, that was a 50% tax rate. And Sunday, he got off. Sunday was his. And today, roughly 50% of our labour is earned in the social democracies of today. So there are comparisons. Obviously, life is considerably better today than it was back then. And if you don't want to work, well, you can find ways of not having to work, or you can own your own business. But the ordinary worker, there are that parallels between the ordinary worker of today and the serf of the Middle Ages. Interestingly, it was the Black Death which effectively began the end of serfdom in Europe, because suddenly there was no shortage of land, but there was a huge shortage of workers. And serfs found they were able to suddenly start charging for their labour, or just they were able to leave, and landlords, lords would pay the serf in order to keep him on the grounds, and the serf could demand his freedom. And this gave rise to a new paid underclass who were handling money for the very first time. And so to take their money from them, the leaders began to impose poll taxes. And then the peasants decided they didn't like these poll taxes. And across Europe, shortly after the Black Death, we saw these peasants' revolts, which was, another battle between the ordinary worker and the leader. This is a never-ending dance where the leader has tried to take what is the lowly man's all throughout history, and it's a dance that continues today.
Right. In the modern day, would you say income tax is sort of the most important form of taxation for the state, and that is most consequential for, say, society? And how did we go from having no income tax, let's look at it from the UK and the US, to now having income tax, which is responsible for a huge percentage of Western government's revenue these days?
You design a society by the way that you tax it. And so, going back to that thing, if you want a free society, you have low levels of taxation and you have high levels of individual responsibility. So if you have low levels of taxes, but then the state can't provide welfare because it doesn't have the income, then it becomes the responsibility of citizens to set up their own forms of welfare. And we saw this in the 19th century, the cooperative societies, the friendly societies. In both Europe and in America, you had them as well. Income tax is a big moral question with income tax, because it's responsible for roughly 50% of government revenue worldwide, if you include things like national insurance and payroll taxes. It's the biggest source of government revenue worldwide. And yet, I find it highly problematic because, A, I think a worker should be able to keep what's his. And secondly, you are penalizing productivity. And if you start out with nothing in your life, all you have is your labor. And yet you are constantly taxed on it, constantly, relentlessly. The power of compounding and incremental growth work against you because you're constantly having what you earn chipped away at. And we don't tax capital or assets in anything like the same way we do income tax. And that's why we have this society that's geared toward asset owners and geared against the worker, and why it's so hard to start out with nothing and make your way to the top just through your labor. If you want to do it, you have to start your own business or become a brilliant investor or a brilliant sportsman or a rock star or something like that. That's not typical labor. So I think it incentivizes society in the wrong way. But the reason we have it is that it's a very easy tax to collect. Governments like taxes that are easy to collect. If it costs you £5, $5 to collect $10 of revenue, that's inefficient. But if it costs you 10 cents to collect $10 of revenue, that's a very efficient form of tax from the point of view of the government. And it's an easy form of tax to collect because the government says to the company, you have to collect this tax for us, and if you don't, we'll close your company down. So it puts the burden of the company becomes the tax collector. And the other reason it's easy to collect is it's deducted at source. So you never actually receive the money you've worked for. You receive the money you've worked for after the taxes have been deducted. And it's been proven that a freelancer doing the same job as an ordinary worker will pay much lower levels of taxes because the tax is paid after the event. There's much more scope to write things off, to make accidental or deliberate non-compliance. And so that's why governments like income tax. It's easy to collect and you can collect lots of it off every single worker. If you taxed wealth, you hear a lot of left-wing arguments we should have a wealth tax. It's just a much harder, never mind the rights and wrongs of it, it's a much harder tax to administer. You can't deduct wealth at source as it's accumulated. Right. You have to deduct it after the event. And then there's so much scope for non-compliance. And that's one of the main reasons we don't have wealth taxes, is just the practicalities of it.
Right.
How did we get income tax? Well, we got income tax in the UK for the first time to raise money to pay for the Napoleonic War. You got it in America for the first time. Abraham Lincoln gave it to you. Abraham Lincoln's presented as this great champion of freedom, but man, he was obsessed with protecting tax revenue. He imposed income tax on Americans for the very first time. He gave you your law that if you leave America and go and live in another country, you still have to pay federal income taxes. And, there's a strong argument in the book that the reason he went to war in the first place was to protect Union tax revenues. He was worried about losing all the Confederate tax revenues because at the time, the Confederate States was paying something like 80 or 90% of federal tax revenues, which is why the Confederate States wanted to leave. But then income tax disappeared again in America after about 1875. And then you got it again in 1913, I think it was. And there was all sorts of reasons why you got it. It's because prior to 1913, most of the federal revenue came from goods entering and leaving the country, tax duties, and they wanted another source of income. The tax system was a bit messy and income tax was simple. In the UK, we abandoned it after the Napoleonic Wars, and then we brought it back in the 1840s, but it replaced like 200 petty taxes. It simplified the tax system. But it never really affected. Another reason you get income tax, you got income tax in the United States, that is an untold story, is that the prohibitionist movement campaigned dramatically for the imposition of income tax, because without it, prohibition could never have happened, because the government was so reliant on taxes on alcohol. But once you had income tax, the prohibitionist movement can argue, we don't need, you can make alcohol illegal now because you no longer rely on the tax revenue for it. It's an untold story, but it's absolutely
taxes and no alcohol.
Yeah. But in any case, when World War I started,
right,
it was World War I in the UK that the thresholds of tax suddenly changed. So prior to World War I, it was only the very rich who paid any kind of income tax. But with World War I, more and more people were dragged into the tax net. And in the case of America, World War II was the big catalyst, the Revenue Act of 1942, which brought ordinary Americans into the tax brackets. But prior to 1942, ordinary Americans did not pay income tax.
Right.
And it was to pay for the war effort. And you had a song written by Irving Berlin to persuade ordinary Americans that this income tax was a good thing. And the lyric of the song went, "I paid my income tax today, 1,000 planes to bomb Berlin. They've got to be paid for. I paid my income tax today," or something like that. And they've got to be 1,000 planes to bomb Berlin. They must be paid for, and I chipped in. I paid my income tax today. That's the lyric. And so was ever the link between tax and war more apparent? But this was supposed to be a happy song that made Americans proud to pay their income tax. Then the war ended, And as with every crisis,
Yep.
the level of freedom never goes back to the level it was before the crisis
Right.
started. Income tax was normalized, and it never disappeared after World War II. It's remained, and it's just steadily grown ever since.
A lesson we should learn today. Yeah, I think it was Milton Friedman who basically helped implement the system. He later regretted it, where the income tax would be taken off the top, right? It was sometime I think after the 40s or 50s, and because prior to that it was self-reporting. You would, at the end of the year, you would report your taxes and then you get that tax money away. And then it was Friedman who thought it'd be more efficient if the employer just took that taxes, right? He took it at the
Yeah,
source.
that's what I talk about when I
Mm.
say deducted at source.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Milton Friedman's a great hero. I didn't know he was responsible for that, but if he was, we need to revise our views of Milton Friedman.
Yeah, well, he later regretted it. He didn't realize at the time. He thought it would be a more sort of efficient way and a more lean way, less bureaucratic way to just do it that way.
Well, he's
Yeah,
right about that.
yeah, yeah.
But the consequence of that efficiency is that it grew.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I
As I
think,
say, government's tax where it's easy to collect.
mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we're learning right now that after you're done with an emergency, the emergency powers don't necessarily go away. They get implemented through other means, or they just stay.
They never go back
Yep.
to the levels they were before the crisis started.
Mm-hmm. That's right. We still have to take off our shoes in the United States for from the war terror, and then we have the no-fly list.
Still wearing masks over there, aren't you?
We're still wearing masks in California. They just in LA a couple days ago got rid of the mask mandate indoor, so that was nice. Much of the rest of the country though was, much more
What a
pro-freedom.
backward nation you live in.
Oh my God, you're sounding like one of my relatives in England now. We always have this fight, but yeah, I mean California's not a good representation of America, right? You made a very interesting point about the taxation of labor and how that shifts society's incentives. And as we know, wealthy people invest in assets, and then they can borrow against those assets and then not have to pay tax. So you don't pay tax on borrowed money. And whereas people who are starting out their lives and who want to reach a more comfortable level, a higher economic level on the socioeconomic ladder, who are starting from nothing, where they're being penalized all along the way, so they can't even accumulate enough money to buy those assets, which are then going to protect their wealth. And so this is very much a regressive. Income tax is regressive against young people and people who are starting out. I always say this myself. It's like California, for example, we have a 10% state income tax on top of your federal tax. It even goes even higher than that, depending on your income. But if you're making under a certain amount, you're not going to pay federal income taxes, but you'll still pay California income tax. And so it's like, what's progressive exactly about charging somebody a 10% tax on making 50K, 60K, 70K, right? These are people who are just starting to get by, and you're taking money from them. Why do you think it is that people on the left can't see that? They can't see how they're actually hurting the very people who they think they're helping, and then they're helping the very people who they claim they want to hurt, which is the very wealthy who benefit from the tax system by being able to shelter their money in assets that they can just borrow against. Why can't they see that?
Because they're incapable of distinguishing between income and capital. It's that simple. The super rich don't rely on their labor or their income for their wealth. And I guess it's because everyone, as soon as you say tax, everyone just thinks income tax.
Right.
And they forget that there are other forms of tax.
Yeah, I mean,
it's an education thing.
Do you think that's all it is, or do you think there's something more to that? Because someone had to, I mean, some of these people aren't dumb, right? Like, why can't they understand the difference? Or is it just that I can't.
I think ideas are viral, and you get taken in with ideas, and often it's hard to see beyond the idea, and that particular idea's got taken hold. I mean, I'm not saying, I don't think all the left think that, but there's a large portion that cannot distinguish between income and capital when it comes to talking about tax. I also think I'm not crazy about the definition left and right wing. It's convenient. And I tend to look, and I'm sure you do as well, Ashton, look through the world more of a prism of authoritarian versus libertarian. But if we're looking at our political compass, there is definitely a thing on the authoritarian left that wants to control whatever, and probably to a certain extent on the authoritarian right, that wants to control what people do, and it doesn't like people doing things and getting on, and there's a lot of jealousy, there's a culture of envy, and all these reasons are also contributive to this thing of wanting to take the proceeds of people's labor,
Mm-hmm.
because it's a form of control. I mentioned at the beginning of the program, tax is control. And, you control people through the tax system. You incentivize them, you guide behavior. It's a form, tax is control. Every king, every emperor, every government, if they lose their tax revenue, they lose their power. And there is this need amongst, human beings. I don't know why, but there's this need to want to control other human beings instead of just going, it's not my business. If you want to go and do that, you do that. It's your business, not mine. It's a religious thing. It used to happen through religion. Now it happens through, whatever's replaced religion, Twitter. but people's behavior would be controlled. We don't want people doing that, make it a sin. That's how people would. And now it used to be priests who would be the thought leaders, and now it's people who host podcasts. I'm not kidding you. I mean, it's people on Twitter who are the thought.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
They've sort of, but there is this need, not amongst everyone, but amongst a lot of people, to control everyone else, and going, we must tax this and tax that is part of it.
I think the authoritarian, libertarian sort of that four square quadrant form of political analysis is definitely more apt than just typical left or right divide. I agree with that. When it comes to taxation, though,
it's funny, but everyone thinks they're in the bottom half.
You think so?
Everyone thinks.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah. There's a few people,
right?
But then you do like I did that political compass test, and I hated the questions because there were so many. Well, there were so many variables within the question. But I've written a book called Life After the State. So that's about as anarchic a pro-libertarian anarchy a title as you will ever have. And I've described tax as daylight robbery. And yet I do that test and I come out centre right. So, what I actually am and what I think I am, there must be a bit of divergence there.
Yeah, I don't think too many people on the left consider themselves authoritarian left, even as they want to control various aspects of people's lives, like what they can eat and what kind of energy they can use and what they can watch and what.
I think they think that people's property, it's a respect for me. Your labour is your private property. You should own your labour and the proceeds that derive from it. They don't have the same respect for private property. But property rights are sort of, a key founding block of a free society. If you don't have private property rights, then it's game over. But there's a core. Just look at the reaction to a riot in wherever, and a window gets smashed and somebody's shop gets looted. It's like, well, they're the poor in society. Well, they got persecuted 200 years ago. Whatever it is. And it's like, no, that one person is stealing from another. But there is a sort of sense of entitlement to other people's property that exists, amongst certain factions.
Yeah, well, raiding a Gucci store is what really brings equality at the end of the day, as we well know. That's what moves society forward. But speaking of that sort of the authoritarian sort of libertarian divide, one way I think you can drive a wedge in between the authoritarian left and libertarian left, because there are libertarian lefts out there, and I have respect for them. I like a lot of them.
Yeah.
Is through.
I think Bernie Sanders
he used to be
a tad of the libertarian.
Yeah, he used to have an angle. I think Glenn Greenwald's probably one of the best examples of that, who's just a diehard civil libertarian and also a person of the left. And I think a lot of the libertarian left, maybe even Dorsey might be a part of that, although he didn't really stand up for that faction before. But I think a lot of the libertarian left are gravitating towards Bitcoin. The authoritarian left hate Bitcoin, like the Elizabeth Warrens and those kinds of people hate it. Because it goes against their control. With respect to, so here's one way that I think you can drive a wedge between like we said, the authoritarian and libertarian sort of people who are into, let's just say on the left for the purposes of the discussion. You make a case that taxation, and tell me if I'm wrong about this, you have governments implementing something like the income tax, and the modern taxation system we have today in the West and large part of the world enables the prolonging of wars while also encouraging basically maybe indebtedness that then devalues the currency and may also lead to prolonging of wars. Can you make the connection? Is there a connection between our modern tax system and, say, the prolonging of wars that we've seen in the 20th century and into this century as well?
Oh, there's a lot more than a connection. There's one cannot exist without the other. You know, without tax, if you got rid of all taxes, then war would not be possible. I'm serious. It sounds ridiculous, but tax is how leaders pay for war. Whether it's the tax of the people that are going to war or the tax of the people that they're fighting against, through plunder and conquest. You conquer another country. If Vladimir Putin conquers Ukraine, he's going to plunder it and then he's going to tax it. What does he want? He wants the land, the labor, the produce, the profit. But taxes make wars possible. But bizarrely, war makes taxes possible. Because, if you'd said to ordinary Americans in 1935, in the middle of the Great Depression, right, we're going to tax everyone, 10, 15, 20%, whatever it is, they would have gone, no, you're not. But suddenly with 1942, you've been bombed by the Japanese. Suddenly there's a justification for it. So war, and it's the same. There's a long history of leaders who've attempted to impose new taxes in times of peace and lost their job as a result, been overthrown, been voted out. But it never happened. In times of war, you need the emergency. So tax makes war possible, and war makes tax possible, and the two are linked. And by the way, I count inflation and currency debasement as a type of tax. Our friend Milton Friedman called it taxation without legislation, which is exactly what it is. But it is still a tax. It's a way of transferring wealth from one person to another, of seizing wealth from one person. But again, there's a long history of war and inflation. You pay for a war by debasing the currency. We paid for World War I by coming off the gold standard. A dollar bought you, or a pound bought you a lot more in 1939 than it did in 1945. There's always an inflation during a war. In the Napoleonic Wars, prices tripled.
Wow.
And I'm sure, this war has started with Russia, and they've already got, one of the reasons Putin banned the sale of ammonium nitrate was because of food inflation in Russia. And now that's led to food inflation in the rest of Europe because nobody's got any fertilizer. And so, and we've seen all the waging war on Putin through the monetary system that's going on. It's incredible watching it. I bet China's watching this and going, right, that's what, when we seize Taiwan, that's what the America's going to do to us. We better get rid of our dollars now while we can. But because they'll only, China, they've seen what the US will do, and China will be able to defend against it. Putin seems pretty vulnerable to it so far, but we're on day 5. There's a long way to go in this. But yeah, war, tax, war, the two make each other possible.
Yeah, with the Russia example right now, so the only thing that so the ruble, by the way, is off, I think 40-something% inflation in the last few days from this whole episode. And
yeah, I tried to short it on Sunday night, but my broker wouldn't let me. And then I woke up on Monday morning, this morning, and it's fallen 30%. And I'm not buying it after it's just fallen 30%. Well, I'm sure it's a good trade to go for. I wouldn't be long the ruble at the moment. Can't see a lot of demand for rubles.
I don't think so. And so they've also blocked some of his foreign reserves, or talking about seizing it. And that might be the thing that puts, if he does back down or takes an off ramp, that might be the kind of pressure that is responsible for that, is by taking his government revenues, is $600 billion, and basically seizing them up.
I think Western governments are quite good at not necessarily putting pressure on the person directly, but putting pressure on the people that will put pressure on the person. And so Western governments are going for the oligarchs, hoping that the oligarchs put pressure on Putin. What I find really interesting is over the last 10 or 15 years, Russia has been relentlessly buying gold, and it's dramatically increased its gold reserves. And, according to my friend Konstantin Kissin, who's Russian, he says Russia's been preparing for this invasion for a long time. And but looking at some of the action that's been reported on social media, it doesn't look like they're that organised. The tanks run out of petrol. But anyway, if it has been preparing, and it's been preparing for de-dollarization and all the rest of it, it's no surprise that it's been buying gold. And as I'm sure you know, China's been accumulating vast amounts of gold as well. It's the biggest producer in the world. It's also the biggest importer. It doesn't export a single ounce.
Do you think they have more than the United
China's
States?
gold holdings are probably already bigger. Yeah, I do. They've declared much less, but if you just look at gold imports just look at gold imports to China, Chinese production, and you add the two together over the last 15 years, and then divide the number by 2. So you assume that half of all the gold that's been produced and mined has gone into private hands, and the other half's gone into the state hands. In all reality, it's probably more than half's gone into the state hands. But if you just assume half, then China has more gold than the United States. And what they're doing is what they declare to the what do they call the IMF is like the minimum believable amount, because China's not ready for a confrontation. China suddenly declared we have more gold than the United States. That would be the biggest declaration of war ever. I'd like to be interested to see what happened to the US dollar if that happened. But in the case of Russia, one wonders, with all the freezing of the accounts and everything that's gone on, if Russia will have to sell its gold, which I guess it would do in Dubai, in order to fund some of what's going on. I don't think we're quite at that point yet. Well, we're quite a long way from that point, but it's an interesting thought experiment.
What do you think about the dollar status as the reserve currency? Do you see that being upended in this decade? If so, what could possibly replace it? I mean, will people really trust Chinese money? And what role do you think the central bank digital currencies will have? Do you think they will have because they're definitely coming out, do you think they'll have a negative effect, a neutral effect, or a positive effect on ensuring the dollar status as the reserve currency of the world?
Okay, there's 2 questions there. Will the dollar still be the world's reserve currency in 10 years' time? Probably just, but it won't be as strong as it is now. The big like the ring, as in the Lord of the Rings, the ring of power is owning the banking system and SWIFT and all of that. Once it loses that, if that ring goes into the fires of Mordor, then the dollar goes with it. So that's the key thing. And I guess the more Bitcoin expands and grows, the more it becomes a threat. I don't know if it's bullshit or not, but I heard somebody saying on Twitter that Putin was considering selling gold for Bitcoin. Well, America can't control that.
Yep.
So that's an interesting, and I think Bitcoin use in Russia is higher than anywhere else in the world. Ordinary Russians use it more than anyone else. So I gather, yeah, and Ukraine is like 5th. I think Nigeria is 2nd. Can't remember. You'd think it would be America, but apparently it isn't. I need that might be fake news, but it's something I read at some point. You always read that the Chinese have got designs. I think we can discount the ruble,
right?
But you always read that the Chinese have got designs on reserve currency status, and China's trying to keep the value of its currency low so that it can carry on exporting its deflation. But that sort of globalization model seems to be falling apart a little bit. But if China backed its money with its gold, and they were saying their CBDC was going to be gold backed, doesn't appear that it now is, because they've already launched it, haven't they, with the Winter Olympics? I believe so. I'm not sure. I haven't followed it. But if China wanted to replace the dollar, all it needs to do is back its money with its gold, and then it's not competing against China. It's competing against gold, which is a rather different dynamic. But I just don't think China, with its authoritarian tendencies, is likely to do that, unless it suits it to do it temporarily, just to usurp the United States. So it's very Hayekian competing currencies, what's happening, because You've got private bodies. He called them private bodies, but private bodies, open source bodies, corporations. Facebook's trying to do its own coin. It can't do it at the moment, but that won't last forever. Amazon points. They're all issuing money of one kind or another. The power of Facebook coin would be extraordinary because its
Yeah, that's why
networks
they're
are
all
so
afraid of
big.
it. Mm-hmm.
You could send me my enormous fee for doing this podcast over WhatsApp in Facebook coin, and so I think the dollar's power on a relative basis will not be what it was in 10 years' time, just because there'll be the competition will have risen both in value and in number. But we're going into a world, say probably until 2010, where there were national currencies, a few corporate points, air miles or whatever, and gold. And now I think we're going to have corporate coins. We're going to have, we've got all sorts of crypto coins. We've got gold, silver, and national currencies. So there's a lot more competition, and that will erode the dollar's supremacy.
Yeah, I think that also leads to probably maybe just having sort of five national currencies left, whereas the vast majority of them sort of go under, which has been kind of the case with fiat currencies. If you track them long enough, the vast majority of them have gone under, of course.
Yeah.
And so it's
the I wonder if we'll ever get Africa coin or Asia coin. I doubt they'll be able to coordinate it in the same way they did the euro. I wonder if the euro was a fluke. They were talking about having that coin, Canadian, America, and Mexico coin at one point. But I think that's gone away. It was about 12 or 15 years ago. I can't see that happening because the problem is, one country might want to do it to become something valuable, but so many countries use monetary policy as a domestic tool, and they all want to print money so that they can do whatever it is governments do. I think there'll be a reluctance to cede the power. Effectively, you're ceding the power to print money by joining a confederation of countries, and I think a lot of governments would be reluctant to do that.
Yeah, and I think with respect to the China possibly overtaking the United States in the currency status realm, if their history is any indication with respect to their securities have been listed on stock exchanges, particularly American ones, the amount of frauds that have been on, I just don't see how a large amount of people are going to trust Xi with monetary integrity, right? So I think something like Bitcoin has a better shot.
Yeah, I mean, even with the Federal Reserve and everything that it does, people still trust
We have a judicial
America
system
and the US more than they trust Putin and whoever.
Yeah, I think that's right, and we still at least have a semblance of checks and balances and some transparency, right? What do you think about these last couple months? A lot of people think it's been a huge endorsement for Bitcoin. You had the situation in Canada where they declared a emergency order, Trudeau did, and basically seized people's bank accounts for even nominal things like donating like $20 to the trucker protest, right? And they added cryptocurrency as part of their anti-money laundering campaign, and then they flagged a few crypto wallets that they found to be supporting the trucker protests. And now with the situation with Russia, we have people are predicting like a run on the banks. As we discussed, you're looking at like 40-50% inflation in a matter of days there. People have also been donating to Ukraine through Bitcoin. And, who knows how many Russians are now moving or attempting to move more of their wealth into that. Do you think that the last couple months, particularly with this Canada and Russia-Ukraine episode, have been anywhere near significant to push Bitcoin adoption across the masses?
Yes, I do. My first taste of this was back in, I think, 2013 it would have been. Maybe it was even sooner. Maybe it was as early as 2011, where do you remember WikiLeaks was really big back then? and it was seen as a real threat to
Mm-hmm.
the United States and a serious embarrassment to the US military in particular, with all the stuff that it was exposing. And people were donating to WikiLeaks via PayPal. And then America did its thing of cutting off the PayPal link. And then people started giving to WikiLeaks via Bitcoin. And then within less than a month of that happening, Satoshi was like, no, don't do this. And then eventually his line was, the hornet's nest is, the hornets are out of the nest, or whatever the line was. And he just stood down from the project altogether, because it was very early in Bitcoin's evolution. It's probably too early to be making an enemy of the United States authorities when it just wanted to get beneath the radar and spread. You know, that guy was a genius. My God,
Right.
I think he must be the cleverest person who's ever lived. But I mean, his reading of things was amazing. And he was probably like, you know, he'd seen what had happened to the PGP dude in the early 1990s when they arrested him just for inventing this privacy technology. And he didn't want it to happen to him, which is probably why he disappeared and why he's kept his identity secret all that time. But so we saw it then, and then we saw the authorities steal $9 million from GoFundMe that was destined for the truckers. And that was literally theft. And presumably there's going to be all sorts of legal suits in Canada at some point. But good luck trying to win against the government in a legal suit, because you're taking on the whole system. But that was theft, and they had no right to do that. But I guess from the government's point of view, these truckers were creating all sorts of disruption, and they needed it to end. And so they would take whatever measures are necessary to make it end. You know, they won't see the truckers as these, in the same way that people sharing videos of them on Twitter will see them. But I just looked at that and I was like, Bitcoin fixes this. And then I was interviewing a guy who he used a pseudonym, but he was an American tech guy working in Ukraine. And he got evacuated from Ukraine last week in Kiev. And he's based, I think he was in Dusseldorf, but it was in a German town not far from the border. He was in Poland. He was in Poland, not far from the border. And he was in an Airbnb, but he was just trying to coordinate this huge campaign to get money to the Ukrainians, to get arms to the Ukrainians, clothes, essential supplies, everything. And he's doing a fantastic job, this bloke, and he was speaking so articulately about it. And then my girlfriend went to give him some money, and it was like a GoFundMe thing. I forget what it was. And they'd cut it off. Now, why the Americans would cut that off, or whoever would cut it off as it's going to help the Ukrainians, I don't know. But again, it just shows you the weakness of centralized systems. But fortunately, this guy was really bright, and he was saying, look, you can donate cryptocurrencies as well. And the cryptocurrencies will be getting through where the fiat money isn't. So, yeah, in times like this, there is a real visible use case for circumventing the middleman, aka there is a real use case for decentralized.
You talk about what genius Satoshi was. I mean, it really, I don't think it's stated enough, because this person had to have had sort of an expert level. I think he was a lawyer. That's coming from a lawyer's background. I believe he was a lawyer. Some people think it's Saba, who's also a lawyer.
You have an unreasonable admiration.
Well, one of the good ones. He's one of the good ones, I think. But I don't think he was a practicing lawyer. I think he has a legal background. Obviously a brilliant,
for sure,
background in contracts law, and in terms of the technology, computer science angle of it as well. In terms of monetary history, he must have had an incredible amount of knowledge on that, and philosophy. So this must have been such a well-rounded, brilliant person.
Reasonable coder, old school, C++, old school. Everyone says the code for Bitcoin was shit, but it worked, and it was resilient. As you say, history, database skills. How good must he have? What kind of database skills must he have had? You know, unbelievable. And that's why I think he was not old, but he can't have been a guy in his 20s, because I just don't believe you can have that much. He was too wise. He'd need to have been around for 20 years or something and acquired
I
some
agree.
wisdom to be able
I
to do
agree.
what he did.
Yep.
But he was
And
definitely a
you know,
prodigy.
his timing was immaculate as well.
He's not spent a single.
Mm-hmm.
He's not spent any single coin. He must have had money. He must have already made money. One assumes he ran his own business. He was
Mm-hmm.
brilliant PR. It was amazing. You know, Bitcoin's got the best PR ever, and nobody's paid to do it. It's all free. It's all with the investors. If you want to increase Bitcoin's
Mm-hmm.
PR, increase the investor base, because everyone who's into Bitcoin is
Right.
trying to orange pill everyone else. Yeah, but he must have had money. Working on the project for as long as he did. He must have had money from another source. Maybe he was from a rich family. Maybe he already had a successful business.
Mm-hmm.
He had time on his hands. So maybe he'd sold his business or somebody else was running it for him. I think he was he was from that generation of tech entrepreneurs that he'd probably be now, I'd say he was
Mm-hmm.
mid to late 50s
Yeah.
is his
Yeah,
age,
I agree with that. And
I reckon. If I was to guess, I would say he was born in 1965. So he was already checking out, you know, give or take 3 years, but he was already, you know, he was on the cypherpunks mailing list. He was into all that stuff in the 90s. So he must have been probably at
mm-hmm.
least late teens in the 90s.
Yeah.
Early
The other
90s.
thing about him, which was incredible, was the fact that so Bitcoin kind of came out the perfect time that it needed to, because 2008,
No,
right? And then by
2008.
2012 it was starting to yeah.
The
White
white
paper
paper was
2008.
2008.
And then it took a few years of a sort of a ramp up to make its way into being something that people outside like the cypherpunk community and geeks who were on Gawks and things like that knew about. And then here we are, sort of in the late teens and then early 2020s, and now we're seeing the dual threat of both authoritarianism coming from the government and the censorship that they are basically trying to implement, both financial censorship in some cases that we saw in Canada, and then on top of that we see the issues with big tech and how they can basically destroy your economic livelihood by a whim and not even have to explain it. So, and Bitcoin provides an answer to both of those, an escape valve to both of those, which is phenomenal. And not to mention all the other cryptocurrency offshoots that came after Bitcoin, largely guided by its example. Do you think that so you talk a little bit about the nation state in your book, and tell me if you think this is correct. Sort of like maybe an unbundling might be in our future, where nation states are maybe in a not opportune position for this era that we're going into, with difficulties collecting taxation with these multinational corporations being able to split their profits in every different place, with the rise of a lot of decentralization and decentralized finance and hurting their sort of tax revenue. At the same time, you have the demography issue, which is all the rich states are having basically no kids, and all these social welfare programs were premised on the funding of, like having like 30 workers for every one retiree, not one retiree per one worker, or maybe even two retirees per one worker. What do you see as, in this century, there's two ways it can go. Either we go into this sort of Chinese Orwellian social credit state where they can utilize data to control even more aspects of your life and make you into more of a serf, or we have the nation state unbundling and they sort of become weaker, and then there's more, decentralization across society, and people, are living in, smaller communities, and it's more of a promising vision. How do you see that playing out, or will it be some parts of the world will be one part, some parts the other?
Well, it's a huge question, and the short answer would be I see a bit of all of that playing out. The nation state as a model, relatively recent, only really 200 years old. I mean, in the cases of, you look at an island like the United Kingdom, and it's, England's been around for much longer, but, where England and where is Scotland and what's been united and what's Wales, and, before 1066, it was all different kingdoms within England. But the thing that defines the nation state, Germany's
Mm-hmm.
only 200 and bit years old. Italy's 150 years old. The United States is, what, 200 and 50 years old, something like that. They're relatively recent, these countries. Now, they're immensely powerful and established, and so they're not going to disappear overnight, but they are designed. Tax systems that define the nation states were built around the Industrial Revolution and the physical movement of goods in a physical world. Physical workers going to work in one place, based in one location, not workers all moving around. Goods coming across a visible border where you tax them at the point of entry. The digital world is very different. We're more and more of us becoming freelance. We're moving more and more between countries. Our income is digital. It's on the internet. We don't necessarily need to be in one jurisdiction. You might find that we're going to see a whole new class of digital nomad worker. We're already seeing it, who lives by a different set of rules to workers based in individual jurisdictions. Where is the good provided? At what point does it go across the border? Where are the profits? Where are the this and that? It's just a lot more muddy. And that's, if you look at how the tax systems have failed to come to terms with the globalized large tech who can put their IP here and their profits there, and the tax systems haven't been able to keep up because they're designed around a physical world, and all the wealth now is digital. Or not all of the wealth, but a large portion of the wealth is digital. And at the same time, governments are taking on all these huge obligations. They're trying to pay for these obligations by debasing their currency. We have the digital economy offering currencies that don't debase at the same rate. So this is going to put pressure, and many sovereign nations, as we now know, the nation states, are just going to go bust. And so there's a chance that, a bit like the Soviet Union, other countries will just emerge from it. It won't be as clean cut and clear as it is in theory or as it is in a book. It'll just be a lot more muddy and messy. But new jurisdictions will emerge. All these Bitcoin guys are trying to form their own little citadels in places. Well, good luck trying to get recognized by as nation states. But maybe because you need the recognition of whoever it is to be a United Nations or someone to get recognized as a nation. But some of them will. But the reason the United Nations will be reluctant to recognize them is because ideologically they'll be different. But so I do see many nation states as we now know them certainly struggling, and in many cases disappearing. And we do seem to be going, Yugoslavia 25 years ago was one country, and now I don't even know how many countries there are in the Balkans. Catalonia's trying to leave Spain. The UK left the European Union. Scotland's trying to leave the UK. There does seem to be this. Texas is talking about seceding. Florida's talking about seceding. I think it's unlikely, but it's still possible. There does seem to be this move towards smaller self-governed bodies. I hope it happens, but I think it's going to be a slow and drawn out and painful process. I think for me, I'm a big champion of local rule. And I think if the people of, say, the United Kingdom were to break up into something akin to the Anglo-Saxon heptarchy, and Kent were to be one kingdom and Wessex were to be another kingdom, and so on, then all the people who think, have one philosophy, they can all move to Kent, and all the people who have another philosophy can move to Wessex, and the country that has the best philosophy will win in the prosperity stakes, and then the country that's got the weaker ones will look at the other one and go, oh yeah, actually we were wrong, we need to do this, and create a healthy competition. Again, nice in theory, much more muddy and less clear in practice. But the nation state, relatively in the context of history, is a relatively recent model, and the countries as we now know them are actually fairly recent inventions. And so there's a case that over the next 50 years, many of them will disintegrate.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of Americans realize that Italy was a series of principalities, and it's younger than the United States as a country. And Germany was kind of the same thing, different regions. You have Bavaria.
It was. They started to unify it. Yeah.
Right.
It was Bismarck who unified Germany, and it was in the 1880s they started to unify Italy. Only as recently as the 1880s, but it was really Mussolini who completed the job. It was a sort of 50-year process, 40-year process, really. And but yeah, and you go to Italy. I mean, not so much now, but Sicily speaks a different language, and most Italians, certainly age 50 plus, speak their local language, whether it's Venetian or Genovese or Roman or Sicilian or
Hmm.
Neapolitan, whatever the language is, and they speak Italian. You know, it's there's a lot of crossover between the two, but there's a much more sense of individual identity in Italy than there is in other
So
parts
your
of
prognosis on the
the
nation
world.
state is hopeful, at least from and optimistic, at least from my standpoint. But then there's also the whole issue with the social credit system and the CBDCs that are going to come out, and the ability of governments now, particularly those on the authoritarian side, although we see that otherwise free countries can become authoritarian a lot quicker than we thought, and they now have powers. Yeah, they're gonna have
So yeah,
powers
it's
that,
amazing.
like, Stalin would have had wet dreams over, right? Like, in terms of their ability to analyze every single aspect of your life and penalize you if you're going on this website, buying this good, playing this video game, and your children can't go to school now, and you can't take a ride now, and you can't go in the airport now, and that brand of authoritarianism, like the sophisticated tech version, the Chinese version, looks like it's going to be quite appealing for a few people out there. So, how do you see the sort of authoritarian angle of this, the Orwellian tech future that we're headed towards in certain parts of the world?
Well, I think some countries are
Mm-hmm.
going to adopt CBDCs, and some of those countries that adopt CBDCs are going to make their money programmable. And the countries that do that, I don't think they realize what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, I think
It's
some
true.
countries are going to insist on designing their own programmable money, and like most government IT schemes, they're not going to be able to make it work. It's going to be crap, and so people will use the ones that do work. But yeah, we know from your health records that you have had the vaccine, and therefore you're going to get this rate of interest on your CBDC, and we're going to give you a Brucey bonus of £100 if you have the booster. We know from your medical records that you haven't had this vaccine, and therefore uh, you don't get this month's UBI.
Mm-hmm.
All that stuff's going to happen in some places, and some citizens are going to get
Mm-hmm.
trapped in it, and the more entrepreneurial ones are just going to get up and leave. And the that's a big battleground in the future, and it's a big battleground for privacy, and it's very, very worrying. The problem they have is inflation,
Mm-hmm.
and there's so many competing currencies, and there's so many alternatives that many will just not use their CBDC. They'll try and use other currencies, and retailers,
Mm-hmm.
people will try and accept non-government currencies where they can. But again, if they make it as convenient as possible, then they stand a chance of winning, because
Yes.
convenience in the marketplace
Oh yeah.
wins.
So last question, I want to ask you about gold, the whole gold versus Bitcoin debate. Now, gold, every single time you think that it's sort of on this trajectory upwards, it seems to run into some sort of downward pressure. And there's a lot of people who think that Bitcoin is going to be the proper store of value, and there's still some people that think maybe gold would be. Why doesn't gold perform the way people think it will, particularly in respect to these crises in which it's supposed to be that store of value and that protection piece?
Because uh, we live in a world where all the value is digital now. Digital is what's scalable. The value is in networks. Uh, you look at the growth of the digital economy compared to the physical economy since, I don't know, the late 1990s, and the former's eclipsed the latter. And gold is the most analog asset there is in a world where all the value is digital. It doesn't have the same meaning for people anymore. You see gold and it is still captivating, but it doesn't. It, it it's gone from our everyday life. Once upon a time, we'd be handling gold, we'd be wearing gold. It's just gone from our everyday life, and I think it's part of me thinks it's become as irrelevant. I'm the first person to have coined
Mm-hmm.
this phrase, by the way, but loads of other people now use it. But it's a bit like the horse was natural transport for 10,000 years, and then we invented the car. and the horse became irrelevant. A horse became a liability. And I think there's a bit of that with gold. But they are all their own beasts. Bitcoin goes through phases. It goes through sort of quiet accumulation. Then it goes through, noisy bull market and blow off top. Then it goes through noisy sell-off. And then it goes into sort of frustrating consolidation. And we're somewhere between noisy sell-off and frustrating consolidation. And then it goes into quiet accumulation again. Similarly, gold had a brilliant bull market from 2001 to 2011. And it went into a bear market, had a great year in 2020, another little bit of a bear market. It looks to me as a chartist, the monthly chart's done a massive cup and handle, which is a very bullish formation. The weekly chart, you look at the last 5 years, it's a beautiful consolidation. All the moving averages are converging, tightening, the noose is gripping, it just looks ready to go. And then you look at the weekly thing up. So, maybe for a little bit, gold's going to outshine Bitcoin. My advice is to own both. I'm damning of gold. I used to love it, but I'm damning of it now. But I still have a very soft spot for it. I wear it around my neck. Look, there you go. It's half an ounce around my neck.
Can't wear that in LA very much anymore.
Well, yeah.
You can't wear a watch really in LA these days either. All right, Dominic, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure to have you. Where can people find you?
Ashton, could I just plug? Yeah, I've got a Substack letter, frisby.substack.uk, frisby.substack.com, and just please sign up to the Substack letter. I put out 2 articles a week. On the weekend, I do something a bit thoughtful, and on the week, I put out something about the markets. And then there's a paid one if you want to get hot investment tips, usually mining companies, sometimes other stuff. And, you'll make a fortune if you invest in my tips. But anyway, sign up for the free one. And if you're interested in the tips, sign up for the paid one. That's Substack. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Cheers, Ashton.
If you enjoyed our show, please click subscribe to stay up to date with our YouTube channel and podcast, and give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts so that we can keep delivering guys some great content. Thanks for listening, and we will be back next week.
We're going to talk about the issues that really matter. Our country, our economy, the Fed, QE, GDP, BTC, NFTs, AOC, the CCP, Cardi B, Yeezy, Yellow Socks, Iran, Joe Biden's dementia, come on, man, and probably sex robots. We stand for a free and open debate and exchange of ideas. And if you disagree with anything we talk about, you are a racist and no better than Hitler. What? Let's get started.